1941. The skies over Europe were on fire. Britain was still standing barely, but its heart, the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, was running out of time. In the summer heat of that year, a small group of British engineers stepped off a train in Detroit. They had crossed the Atlantic, not for glory but for survival. Their mission was simple in words, impossible in practice, and convince an American car company to build the most sophisticated aircraft engine on Earth. They carried blueprints so secret they were escorted by armed guards, and they carried something else, skepticism. When one of them saw the Packard, motor car company's assembly floor, he reportedly muttered, "The Americans can't build a watch, let alone a Merlin." But Packard's chief engineer Jesse Vincent didn't flinch. Detroit had built America's cars, trucks, tanks, and dreams, and now it was about to build something Britain could no longer make fast enough. The men from Detroit and Derby shook hands, oil-stained palms meeting, polished shoes. Neither side trusted the other, but history was about to force them to. Because in the end, it wouldn't be the British Spitfire or the American Mustang that buried the Luftwaffe. It would be the engine they shared. The story begins 2 years earlier. 1939, Britain was alone, its skies filling with the black crosses of the Luftwaffe. At the heart of its fragile defence stood two fighters, the Supermarine Spitfire and the Hawker Hurricane, both powered by the same miracle of engineering, the Rolls-Royce Merlin. It wasn't the fastest engine in the world, nor the strongest, but it was the most balanced, a perfect harmony of lightness, speed, and altitude performance. 12 cylinders, liquid-cooled, supercharged. It could pull 9 tons of fighter and pilot into the sky and still climb. In those desperate months of the Battle of Britain, every Merlin counted. But the problem wasn't the engine itself, it was how few there were. Rolls-Royce, a company famous for handcrafted luxury, was suddenly expected to produce thousands of complex engines a month. Their factory at Crewe was immaculate, white-coated men, hand-filing pistons, checking tolerances with micrometers, assembling each Merlin as if it were a piece of jewelry. But war doesn't wait for craftsmanship. Engines were blowing out, factories were bombed, skilled machinists were dying or drafted. By 1940, the Air Ministry faced an impossible question. How do you mass-produce precision without destroying it? The answer, whispered in backrooms and telegrams, came from across the ocean. The United States, the land of mass production, of Henry Ford's assembly lines and roaring factories. If anyone could turn the Merlin into a machine that could be built by the tens of thousands, it was Detroit. But to the British, that idea sounded almost blasphemous. The Merlin wasn't a car engine. It was art delicate, temperamental, alive. Yet desperation leaves little room for pride, and so the call went out to Packard Motor Car Company. It was September 1941 when the official agreement was signed. The British government would license the Rolls-Royce Merlin to be built in America, not by an aircraft manufacturer, but by Packard, the maker of fine automobiles. To the British it seemed insane. To the Americans it was a challenge. Packard was known for building the most luxurious cars in the United States, elegant machines for millionaires and presidents, but aircraft engines were something else entirely. A single Merlin contained more than 14,000 precision parts. It demanded tolerances so tight that even a speck of dust could destroy it at full throttle. When the first batch of Rolls-Royce blueprints arrived in Detroit, Packard's engineers were stunned. The drawings weren't standardized. Each part had been hand-measured, hand-labeled, some even annotated in pencil. No two engines were identical. One Packard engineer later said, "We had to measure the blueprints before we could build from them." To mass-produce the Merlin, Packard had to reimagine it from the ground up, not to change its soul but to make it consistent. They introduced new tooling, new gauges, new machine processes that Rolls-Royce had never used, catalogued every bolt, every bearing, every fit. For the first time, the Merlin would be standardized. Any part could fit any engine anywhere in the world. Still, British advisors hovered over the process, horrified by what they saw. When Packard suggested altering thread pitches to match American tools, one Rolls-Royce man reportedly shouted, "You'll ruin it!" But Packard's chief engineer, Jesse Vincent, calmly replied, "Gentlemen, we'll build your engine, but we'll build it the Packard way." So Detroit began its transformation from luxury to war. The same assembly lines that once crafted shining chrome, limousines now thundered with the rhythm of lathes, presses, and pistons. At first, even Packard's own workers doubted it could be done. But slowly, methodically, Detroit's precision met Britain's craftsmanship, and something extraordinary began to take shape. By early 1942, the Packard plant in Detroit was unrecognizable. Gone were the polished sedans and showroom chandeliers. Their place stood rows of steel machines humming with the pulse of war. Packard engineers had taken the Merlin's elegant complexity and turned it into a repeatable miracle. They developed new jigs and fixtures so precise that engines could be assembled like instruments, not experiments. They replaced hand fitting with micrometer-checked precision. Every gasket, every valve, every camshaft was now identical. A word the original Rolls-Royce manuals never dared to use. And yet the true magic was that Packard didn't just copy the Merlin, they improved it. They redesigned the lubrication system to stop chronic oil leaks. They fixed small inefficiencies in cooling and airflow. They even changed certain materials, swapping out components for more durable American alloys that could withstand the brutal temperatures of high-altitude combat. The new engine was officially designated the Packard V, 1650 Merlin. It roared to life for the first time on a cold day. In Detroit, engineers standing silent as the test cell shook. At full throttle, its 12 cylinders screamed like a metallic symphony, smoother, stronger, and more consistent than the originals from Derby. When British engineers came to inspect it, they were speechless. This wasn't an imitation, it was evolution. Packard had achieved the unthinkable industrialized perfection without losing character, a British masterpiece reborn through American production. Soon these engines would power British Mosquitos, American bombers and fighters rolling off assembly lines by the hour. But the engine's greatest destiny still lay ahead in a plane that until now had been dismissed as average. Because in a few months a Packard-built Merlin would be dropped into the sleek fuselage of a new American fighter, the P-51 Mustang, and the world above 15,000 feet would never be the same again. It was early 1943, and the Allies had a problem. American bombers, the B-17 seconds and B-24 seconds, were being shredded over Germany. They could reach Berlin, but their escorts couldn't. The Luftwaffe waited for them deep inside the continent, out of range of the short-legged fighters. The result was slaughter. Then came a desperate idea from the engineers at North American Aviation. What if we drop the Packard Merlin into the P-51? The Mustang up to that point had been fast but flawed. Its Allison engine gasped for air above 15,000 feet. It was a low-altitude racer, not a high-altitude hunter. But when they fitted the sleek fuselage with a Packard V 1650 Merlin, everything changed. The first test flight stunned the pilots. The Mustang shot upward, climbing effortlessly past 20,000, then 25,000 feet. Its acceleration was vicious, its range nearly double that of anything else in the sky. The Merlin had given the P-51 wings it never knew it had. By late 1943, the first P-51B squadrons arrived in England. They looked sleek, modern, like silver arrows. But it wasn't the airframe that terrified the Luftwaffe. It was the sound. When those 12 cylinders roared in unison, it wasn't the coarse growl of a radial engine. It was a smooth, high-pitched scream that echoed across the clouds. Luftwaffe pilots would later describe it as the sound of inevitability. Soon the Mustangs were escorting bombers all the way to Berlin and back. They danced with Messerschmitts at 30,000 feet, diving from the sun with deadly precision. In radio chatter, one German pilot was heard muttering, "There is no escape now." By the spring of 1944, bomber losses plummeted. The long-range P-51 seconds had turned the tables, and with every Merlin-powered Mustang that took off from British soil, another piece of the Luftwaffe began to crumble. But While the skies above Europe burned, the real war machine was roaring thousands of miles away inside a Detroit factory that never slept. Back in Detroit, the war was fought not with guns, but with machines. Inside the massive Packard plant on the East Grand Boulevard, engines thundered day and night. Rows of workers, men and women, young and old, stood beneath the glow of industrial lamps, hands black with oil and aluminum dust. Their rhythm was steady, their precision absolute. For every Merlin that roared over Europe, there was a woman at a lathe, a man checking tolerances with calipers, a team lifting crankshafts into place. It was a factory turned cathedral, a symphony of clanging steel and roaring test cells. By 1944, Packard was producing one Merlin every hour, each one tested, tuned and stamped with a small brass plate that read, Packard Motor Car Company, Detroit, Michigan. Over 55,000 Packard-built Merlins would leave that plant before the war ended, more than Rolls-Royce and Ford of Britain combined. And yet what made it remarkable wasn't just quantity, it was quality. Every engine had to pass performance tests so strict that even slight imperfections meant rejection. When the RAF received their first shipments, they were astonished. The Packard Merlins ran smoother, started quicker, and lasted longer than their hand-built originals. There was poetry in that Britain's finest design, perfected by American mass production. Precision multiplied. The plant itself became a Britain's process, monument to Allied unity. British inspectors walking the lines beside Detroit foremen, American machinists learning to pronounce supercharger impeller the way their British counterparts did. Every worker understood what was at stake. This wasn't just another car engine. This was the heartbeat of victory. And as thousands of Mustangs, Mosquitos and Lancasters roared into the sky, the Luftwaffe began to feel the full weight of that industrial power. Because when you can't replace your engines and your enemy can build one every hour, you don't just lose the air war, you lose the war itself. By late 1944, the Luftwaffe was collapsing. Its once proud Jagdgeschwader, the fighter wings of the Reich, were grounded more often than they flew. Fuel was scarce. Engines failed faster than they could be repaired. But one day, deep in occupied Europe, German engineers gathered around the wreck of a downed American fighter, a P-51 Mustang. It had crashed mostly intact, and inside it, a Packard-built Merlin engine. They lifted the cowling and stared. The precision was shocking. Each part perfectly machined, the finish almost surgical. Every component standardized, stamped with part, numbers and quality marks. They had never seen anything like it. In Germany, aircraft engines like the Daimler-Benz DB 605 or Junkers Jumo 213 were still largely hand-built. Brilliant designs, yes, but assembled in small batches by expert craftsmen. They could make a few thousand a year. Packard was making that many every month. One Luftwaffe engineer later remarked, "We could never build this many, not like this." What they were looking at wasn't just an engine. It was a weapon of industry. The United States had achieved something the Axis never could, the merging of precision and scale. And that was the real turning point of the air war. The Allies didn't just outfight the Luftwaffe, they outbuilt it. Every time a German factory was bombed, a new American one doubled its output. Every time a Messerschmitt fell, 3 new Mustangs took to the skies. By the beginning of 1945, the Luftwaffe was gone, its pilots exhausted, its runways silent, and in hangars across Germany the wrecks of Me-109 seconds and FW-190 seconds lay beside the twisted remains of engines that could no longer compete with Detroit steel. The war in the air was over, and the Merlin, Britain's masterpiece reborn in America, had buried the Luftwaffe for good. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, the Merlin's roar began to fade, but its legend had only just begun. In the months after victory, Allied engineers took stock of what had carried them through the storm. They didn't point to tanks or bombs first. They pointed to engines. The Packard Merlin stood as a symbol of something far greater than horsepower. It was proof of what happens when pride gives way to partnership. Britain had the design, America had the factories. Together they built the sound of freedom. Pilots who had flown the Mustang during the war would later say the same thing. When you opened the throttle and that Merlin sang, it was like flying a miracle. For many, the sound of that 12-cylinder scream meant life. It meant bombers coming home. It meant airmen surviving another mission. It meant the Allies taking back the sky. After the war, thousands of surplus Packard Merlins were repurposed for racing planes and experimental aircraft. Even decades later, restorers discovered something fascinating. The American-built engines were often more reliable than the British originals. Packard's process. Those precise tolerances and interchangeable parts had created a standard so perfect that even modern engineers admired it. The partnership between Rolls-Royce and Packard would influence post-war aerospace collaboration for generations. It showed the world that innovation isn't born in isolation, it's forged in cooperation. Today, when historians look back at the machines that defined the Second World War, they often name the Spitfire, the Lancaster, the Mustang, but behind them all was the same heartbeat, the Merlin, half British, half American, and wholly unstoppable. They laughed at America's copy. They called it an imitation, a cheap knockoff. But that copy, forged in the steel heart of Detroit, became something far greater than the sum of its parts. 55,000 Packard Merlins roared across skies from Normandy to Berlin. They gave the Allies the reach, the speed, and the power to dominate the air. They turned the P-51 Mustang into a legend. They buried the Luftwaffe beneath a storm of precision, persistence, and industrial might. In the end, this was not just a story about engines or factories. It was a story about two nations separated by an ocean, but united by a single-purpose victory. When you hear a Merlin fire up today, whether in a museum or on a vintage flight, listen closely. You're hearing the sound of determination, the echo of cooperation, the quarter roar that changed history, the engine that saved a world.